We've been led to see James Dean as the ultimate cool, a guy who lived on the edge, scoffed at rules, and with a kamikaze grin, floored the gas pedal, racing toward death. But that's the biggest lie pop culture ever sold. His famous squint, just a result of terrible eyesight. His slouched walk, the stance of a frightened child. And his rebellion, the desperate cry of a 9-year-old boy abandoned by his father at a train station next to his mother's coffin. The real horror lies in the seconds before the crash. He wasn't chasing death. Moments before the wrecked Porsche crushed his body, America's top rebel uttered words that chill the blood. He's got to stop. He sees us. Today, we'll peel back the psychological layers of James Dean and discover how blind childhood faith in rules extinguished a Hollywood icon. Act 1. Rejected by his father. To grasp the magnetism of James Dean, we need to journey through time and space, darker than any noir film. When biographers speak of a star's tough childhood, they usually gloss over poverty or strict parents. But for Dean, what happened in 1940 didn't just affect him. It obliterated his former self and created the gaping void we later mistook for mystery. Without understanding this precise moment in time, all talk of his method or style is pointless. We must see the moment his heart broke for the first time. It was a scene worthy of Dostoevsky, played out on America's railways. A 9-year-old boy named Jimmy boards a train in sunny Los Angeles. He's set to travel over 1,000 miles back to Indiana. But this isn't a holiday trip to Grandma's. In the same train, just a few cars away from his compartment, a wooden box stands in the cold, dark baggage hold. Inside lies the body of his mother, Mildred Wilson Dean. She died of cancer at 29. To little Jimmy, Mildred wasn't just a parent. She was his only friend, his playmate, his absolute deity. And now he rides for 2 days to the monotonous clatter of wheels, knowing his deity lies in a box, and he's utterly alone in a vast world. But the true horror that shaped his psyche wasn't on the journey. It waited at the final station. The boy traveled with one thought: Dad will meet me. Winton Dean, his father, was a mythical figure to him, strict but reliable. The child's logic was flawless. If Mom's gone, then Dad and I must stick together to survive. He expected his father to take him, hold him, and grieve together. Reality hit with such force that Dean couldn't recover for the next 15 years. When the train arrived at the platform in Fairmount, Indiana, the meeting was shockingly cold. Winton Dean met his wife's coffin. He met his son. And right there on the platform, he committed an act of betrayal that defined James's entire future. Winton declared he couldn't care for his son. He said he needed to work, had debts from Mildred's treatment, and was emotionally drained. Instead of taking the frightened, lost child into his home, he literally handed him over to relatives, his wife's sister Hortense and her husband Marcus Winslow, who lived on a farm. Try to picture this scene through the eyes of a 9-year-old. He doesn't grasp financial difficulties or male depression. In his child's world, it was crystal clear. My mom died, and my dad looked at me and decided he didn't need me. He threw me away. It was in this moment that James Dean's fundamental trauma took root, the belief in his own defectiveness. He decided something was wrong with him if even his own father refused to stay by his side. This spawned a monstrous, insatiable hunger for attention. His entire future career became an attempt to replay that scene at the station. Every time he stepped onto the school stage, and later the Hollywood set, he subconsciously reached out to his father. His logic transformed into this: if I become the most famous, the brightest, the loudest person on earth, Dad will finally see me. He'll realize what he lost and come back. For Dean, acting wasn't a profession, but a desperate cry for love. He didn't want an Oscar. He wanted that cold man on the platform to say, "I'm sorry, son, I love you, let's go home." But his father stayed silent, and Dean screamed louder, turning his personal pain into art that sent shivers down millions of spines. We watched the screen and saw a hero, but in reality, we were looking at an abandoned child, forever stuck at that station. Act 2. Coolness as a shield. We've reached the most dangerous and alluring part of the James Dean myth. Today, the word cool is as tightly linked to him as relativity is to Einstein. For decades, marketers, stylists, and fashion mags have sold us his image as the pinnacle of male confidence. They tell us, look at him, he's independent, he's calm, he doesn't care what anyone thinks. We mimic his style, his gaze, his poses, hoping to capture even a fraction of that magic. But reality hits like a sucker punch. What the world saw as supreme confidence was really a glaring symptom of severe neurosis and social dysfunction. His legendary coolness wasn't a show of inner strength, but a thick, impenetrable shell hiding a man terrified of the world. Strip away the glossy veneer, and you'll find not an alpha male, but a scared turtle, head tucked in, bracing for a blow. In psychology, there's a concept called preemptive rejection. It works like this. If someone is terrified of being abandoned, hurt, or humiliated, and Dean, haunted by that Indiana train station, feared just that, they do everything possible to make people not want to get close. They build a wall. James Dean's style was that wall. His famous nonchalance, his wrinkled tees, dirty jeans, and scuffed boots in an era when men wore pressed suits and hats, wasn't a conscious rebellion against the system. It was a way of saying, I reject your rules, your etiquette, and you before you can judge me and find me lacking. It wasn't the charisma of a leader, but the survival strategy of a loner. Let's dive into the details of his everyday life in New York and early Hollywood, usually left out of heroic biographies. James Dean often behaved like a social disaster. When he showed up for auditions or meetings with big-shot producers, he looked like he'd just crawled out of a dumpster. There are documented cases of him arriving at important meetings barefoot, in clothes that hadn't seen a wash in weeks. Once he showed up at a studio with pants held up by a single safety pin because the zipper was broken, and he was too lazy or scared to fix it or buy new ones. Why would an incredibly handsome, talented guy act like a city madman? It was an unconscious test. If he showed up clean, polite, and eager and got rejected, it would destroy him. It would mean he was bad as a person. But if he came in dirty, rude, mumbling instead of answering, picking his nose and got rejected, he could save his ego. He'd tell himself, they didn't reject me because I'm talentless, but because I acted provocatively. I was in control. Consider his famous body language, that squint that drove millions of women wild and was seen as the height of sexual mystery. In reality, James Dean was terribly nearsighted. Without his thick glasses, he could barely see past his nose. But in public, he was embarrassed to wear glasses, seeing them as a sign of weakness. So his smoldering look was just a basic attempt to see his conversation partner through the blur. He squinted not from coolness, but from physical helplessness. And his posture. Look at any photo. shoulders hunched, back slouched, hands deep in pockets, chin tucked to chest. It's the classic fetal position, the stance of someone trying to take up as little space as possible and protect vital organs, stomach and heart, from potential attack. The world looked at this tense, poorly sighted, rough and socially awkward guy and made the greatest misinterpretation. People decided, "Oh my God, look how mysterious he is. He doesn't need anyone." It was tragic irony. He needed everyone. He desperately craved love and approval, but the fear of being betrayed again forced him to wear the mask of an indifferent cynic. And that mask stuck to his face, becoming his prison. Act 3. The birth of an actor. To grasp how a 24-year-old could channel such bottomless, terrifying emotion that it pinned audiences to their seats, we need to flip our understanding of acting on its head. We usually think a great actor is a master of disguise, someone who can wear a mask, pretend to be someone else, and lie with virtuosity. With James Dean, it was the exact opposite. His talent wasn't a divine gift or the result of relentless training. It was a side effect of deep attachment trauma. He became an icon not because he could hide his feelings or play a role, but because he had lost the ability to shield himself from the world. This emotional nakedness, which mesmerized the camera, was instilled in him by the most important person in his life, his mother, Mildred. And it was her loss that turned his life into an endless quest for a substitute. Mildred Wilson was not just a mother who fed and clothed little Jimmy. She was the architect of his soul and the sole audience for his first performances. She saw her son not as an ordinary child, but as a work of art to be carefully refined. Their bond was symbiotic, almost mystical. In their small house in Santa Monica, they created their own isolated world. Mildred understood her son was special, and she taught him to feel life, not just live it. She invented the game of wishes for him. They would write their deepest dreams on little paper boats and set them afloat, believing if the boat sailed away, the wish would come true. She enrolled him in violin lessons, even though he lacked a remarkable ear. She taught him tap dancing right in the kitchen. They molded clay figures together, creating entire toy worlds. She built a safe, magical cocoon around Jimmy, where sensitivity, tears, and imagination weren't seen as weaknesses, as his father believed, but as signs of talent. In this cocoon, he was loved unconditionally. But when Jimmy was 9, that cocoon was brutally torn apart from the inside. Cancer consumed Mildred swiftly and painfully. The boy watched as the center of his universe faded, transforming from a joyful dreamer into a withered shadow. Her death wasn't just the loss of a relative. It was the collapse of reality itself. His mother's death tore a black hole in him that he would spend the rest of his life trying to fill, but never could. In the psychology of creativity, there's a theory that many great artists create from a deficit of love. James Dean is a textbook example of this principle. Losing his sole source of unconditional warmth, Mildred, and immediately facing icy rejection from his father, he found himself in a vacuum. How does a child survive when they desperately need love, but there's no one around to give it? He finds a surrogate, a global replacement. He decides that if 1,000,000 strangers in a dark theater love him, maybe that massive collective love could replace his one and only mom, even for a moment. His acting wasn't a career, not a way to earn money or fame. It was a means to revive that sense of security Mildred provided. Every time he stepped on stage or into a frame, he unconsciously reached out to her. Biographers often miss this intimate detail, but Dean's close friends recalled a chilling fact. In moments of intense stress, loneliness, or failure, he would often retreat into himself and speak of her in the present tense, as if she were still sitting in the next room. This trauma made his psychological skin transparent. An average person grows a shell of cynicism over the years, learns not to react to pain. Dean remained an exposed nerve. He retained the ability to feel pain with the same unbearable intensity as a 9-year-old at the bedside of a dying mother. When the camera rolled, the audience didn't see a professional's performance. We saw the raw, living pulse of that pain. We looked at the screen and thought, my God, how brilliantly he portrays suffering in East of Eden. But he wasn't acting. He was just remembering. He used the film's script as an excuse to legally mourn his loss in front of everyone. He gave us his real tears because he had no one else to give them to. Act 4. Therapy over craft. Here we dive into the technical side of James Dean's magic, which was really a dangerous psychological experiment on a living soul. Dean became one of the brightest figures of the so-called method, a revolutionary acting technique taught at the legendary Actors Studio in New York under the guidance of Lee Strasberg. But there's a colossal misconception in film history. Critics and audiences lump Dean together with Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift as great method actors. The truth is, their use of the method was fundamentally different. For Brando, it was a precise surgical tool he wielded with control. For Dean, it became a weapon of mass self-destruction. The line between playing a role and being oneself blurred completely. He turned the film set into a psychoanalyst's office, where he metaphorically, and sometimes almost physically, cut open his veins for the camera. The essence of the method, developed by Lee Strasberg from Stanislavski's ideas, lies in using effective memory. To portray grief, an actor shouldn't just mimic a crying face or use glycerin drops. They must recall a real, specific moment from their own life when the pain was unbearable. A pet's death, a breakup, school humiliation, and drag that feeling out into the open, here and now. For most professional actors, it's a complex but controlled technique. They dive into the memory, grab the emotion, and return to safe reality. For James Dean, with his massive baggage of unresolved childhood trauma and complete lack of psychological defenses, it was like picking at a festering wound for the audience's amusement. He didn't just study at the Actors Studio. He turned it into his personal clinic, where therapy happened in front of everyone, but without the goal of healing. The goal was pain. Let's transport ourselves to the stifling, smoke-filled room of the Actors Studio in early 50s Manhattan. The atmosphere felt less like a classroom and more like a cross between a religious cult and an operating room. James Dean idolized Marlon Brando. Brando was the undisputed king of this place, but there was a massive gulf between them. Brando had thick skin and a cynical mind. He could turn on rage, smash furniture to bits, and a second after cut, calmly ask, "What's for lunch?" Brando controlled his demons. He was their master. James Dean let the demons control him. When he needed to cry in a scene, he didn't use breathing techniques. He mentally returned to that train in 1940. He saw his mother's coffin again. He heard his father's icy voice on the platform again. He ripped open his most terrifying, blocked memories over and over. Fellow students at the Actors Studio recalled that watching Dean's scenes was sometimes physically painful and awkward. It didn't look like art. It looked like a genuine nervous breakdown of a disturbed person. He could start screaming, banging his head on the floor, sobbing so hard that he couldn't be calmed for half an hour after the session ended. He lost touch with reality. Lee Strasberg, being a tough and insightful teacher, saw this. He understood he had unique, explosive material in front of him. He encouraged this self-destruction because it produced incredible results on stage. Strasberg demanded complete truth, and Dean delivered it, peeling off his own skin. That's why his acting is so starkly, radically different from old-school actors like Humphrey Bogart or Cary Grant. Those actors represented emotions, wore them like fine suits. Dean lived them like diseases. But the price for living them was monstrous. Every successful take cost him a piece of real life and mental health. He didn't know how to step out of a role because the role was built on his own, real tragedy. He used film not to create art, but to scream his pain to the world. And the world first heard that scream in the film that became his public confession. Act 5. Public Confession. If you're searching for a documentary on a man's mental breakdown, skip the secret medical files. Just watch East of Eden. This was James Dean's first major role, the one that sparked worldwide hysteria over his name. But the millions sobbing in theaters had no clue they weren't witnessing a young talent's brilliant performance. They were watching him relive his personal, unhealed nightmare. Legendary director Elia Kazan was a genius artist, but an even more brilliant and cynical manipulator. Before filming, he met Dean's father, Wynton, and was struck by the man's coldness and detachment. Kazan understood instantly. He hired James not despite his deep psychological issues, but because of them. He needed a guy who truly, at a cellular level, hated his father, yet craved his love so much it made his knees shake. Dean didn't even need to read the script. He'd been living it since that day at the train station. The film's plot, based on John Steinbeck's novel, revolves around the eternal biblical theme of Cain and Abel. Dean's character, Cal Trask, is the bad, misunderstood son, desperate to earn the love of his stern, religious father, Adam. For the father's role, Kazan specifically chose Raymond Massey. It was a devilishly precise choice. Massey was an actor of the old British school, stiff, strict, conservative, and far removed from any psychological experiments. In real life, Massey couldn't stand Dean. He saw him as an uncouth, dirty pup who was always late, mumbling, and clueless about his lines. Elia Kazan didn't try to mend their rift. On the contrary, he did everything to fan the flames of their feud. He egged Dean on to provoke Massey, insult him, throw him off balance. He whispered to Massey that Dean was mocking him on purpose. The electric tension you see on screen isn't acting chemistry. It's real, raw hatred and total misunderstanding between two people. For Dean, Raymond Massey stopped being a co-star. He became a living projection of his own father, Wynton Dean. The climax of this brutal psychological experiment came in one of the most famous scenes in cinema history, the birthday money scene. In the story, Cal, Dean's character, secretly makes a fortune speculating on beans to cover his father's business losses. On his father's birthday, Cal proudly presents him with a wad of cash, hoping this gesture will finally melt the ice and earn him the long-awaited recognition. But the father, Massey, coldly rejects the gift, declaring he won't accept money made from war profiteering, demanding it be returned. In the original script, Cal's reaction was simple. He was supposed to turn and run out of the room. But James Dean couldn't do it. The script demanded action, but his soul demanded a scream. When the camera rolled and Raymond Massey delivered his cruel words of rejection with icy calm, Dean's nerves snapped. He didn't run. Instead, sobbing, he lunged at his father, clutching him desperately, almost choking him, trying to squeeze even a drop of love from this stone-cold man. Watch that scene closely again. You'll see genuine shock and disgust on Raymond Massey's face. He froze, his arms limp, trying to pull away, looking over Dean's head in confusion. "What is this idiot doing?" This isn't in the script. It was pure improvisation born of despair. But Elia Kazan, watching from behind the camera, didn't yell, "Cut!" He let the film roll on, that primal wail that escapes Dean's throat, the tears streaming down his face. It's not Cal Trask crying for a fictional Adam. It's James Dean crying for his real father, Winton. It was a moment of total, shameful soul-baring before millions. He revealed his darkest secret to the world. A true rebel doesn't want to burn down his father's house. A true rebel just wants his father to open the door and let him in. This moment shattered the invisible barrier between screen and audience. Teenagers of the 50s, used to cardboard heroes, saw for the first time not a character, but a living, bleeding pain. They saw what they felt, but were too afraid to show. Dean gave men permission to cry, but he paid the price by erasing the line between his life and his role, losing himself in this maze of mirrors. Act 6, In Search of the Perfect Father. We've hit one of the most taboo and tangled threads in James Dean's life. It's a topic often reduced to sleazy gossip or, conversely, swept under the rug. The myth paints Dean as the ultimate lone wolf, an alpha male who walks his own path, swaps women like gloves, and answers to no one. This image became a role model for millions of men. But peek into his real life, beyond the glossy photo shoots, and you'll see a picture that shatters this masculine myth to pieces. James Dean was pathologically dependent. He couldn't stand being alone. His brief adult life wasn't a tale of a conquering lover, but a relentless, agonizing search for the perfect dad who'd finally accept him, shield him from the cruel world, and tell him what to do. Hollywood in the 50s buzzed with rumors about his sexual orientation. Was he gay? Bisexual? A straight guy experimenting? The debates rage on. But reducing it all to sex is a criminal oversimplification of his complex psyche. For Dean, sex was currency, a tool, not the goal. His key relationships with men, whether romantic, friendly, or professional mentorships, followed a rigid pattern. He sought an authoritative, strong, dominant figure to submit to. He needed a guide. A glaring example, often scrubbed from official biographies, is his relationship with Rogers Brackett. Brackett was a successful radio director, wealthy, educated, and influential in the media world. When they met, Dean was a nobody, a studio parking attendant, broke, sleeping in his car. Brackett became everything to him. This wasn't a partnership of equals. It was classic patriarchal guardianship. Brackett housed him, fed him, dressed him in expensive clothes, taught him manners, introduced him to the right people, and essentially paid his way into life. In this relationship, Dean wasn't the rebel, but a lost, obedient boy, letting himself be led by the hand because he was terrified of taking responsibility for his own life. Let's see how this need for a strong hand played out in his Hollywood work. It explains why he acted so strangely with different directors. With director George Stevens on the set of Giant, Dean clashed because Stevens was cold and authoritarian, but withheld affection. He reminded Dean of his real father, Winton, sparking aggression in the actor. But with director Nicholas Ray on the set of Rebel Without a Cause, it was different. Ray became another surrogate father, but a kind father. Witnesses recalled their relationship went far beyond professional. Dean practically stalked Ray. He spent every evening at his bungalow, sat at his feet, literally on the floor, listened to his stories, mimicked his walk and gestures. There's a huge, bitter irony that the global symbol of independence was actually a man who couldn't make a single important decision without a mentor's nod. His famous rebellion was only safe when someone big and strong stood behind him, ready to protect him if he failed. Dean mastered the art of manipulating these men, using his helplessness as a powerful psychological weapon. He instinctively knew, if he looked lost, miserable, and vulnerable enough, someone strong would feel the urge to rescue him. "Take care of me because I can't do it myself," his demeanor broadcasted. This was a survival strategy of a frightened child, not a grown man's life plan. And it was this inner child, seeking protection, that played a cruel trick on him in his most famous film. The world saw a guy in a cool red jacket and assumed he wanted freedom. But no one noticed that the man in that jacket was actually begging for boundaries, rules, and a firm father's word. Act 7. The Trap of the Red Jacket. Step outside and ask a random passerby who James Dean is. Chances are, they won't recall a single movie title, but they'll paint you a picture. A guy in a bright red jacket leaning against a wall. That red nylon windbreaker became the shroud of Turin for 20th century pop culture. A sacred symbol. We've been trained to read this color code one way. Red means danger, aggression, sex, revolution. We see the poster and spot a gang leader laying down the law, but this powerful image crafted the grandest illusion in cinema history. We see the picture but miss the essence. Watch Rebel Without a Cause with open eyes, stripped of fan love, and you'll find something that shatters the legend. Jim Stark, Dean's character, isn't an aggressor. He's a victim begging for punishment that never comes. Director Nicholas Ray's film became a manifesto for a generation. But for James Dean, it held a deeply personal, tragic meaning. It wasn't a tale of teens tearing down the old world. It was a story about the catastrophic weakness of fathers. The film's dramatic conflict isn't about a teen overthrowing the system to usher in anarchy. It's the opposite. The teen is in primal terror because the system, personified by the father, is broken, soft, pliable, and spineless. Even the famous McGregor jacket wasn't picked to make Dean cool. Costume designers and the director wanted to highlight him as a bloody open wound, or a distress signal against the gray, indifferent, beige world of adults. He didn't wear that jacket like a knight's armor. He wore it like a target at a shooting range. Let's dissect two key moments in the film that prove we've been worshiping the wrong idol for 70 years. Scene 1. The knife fight at Griffith Observatory. Remember this iconic scene. The gang surrounds Jim Stark. He's holding a switchblade. How does America's main rebel act? He doesn't attack. He doesn't crack jokes. Look at his body. His shoulders are tense, knees bent, movements erratic. His eyes reflect not the thrill of battle, but the primal fear of a cornered animal. He doesn't want to fight Buzz, the gang leader. He wants to befriend him. In a deleted scene in the film's subtext, it's clear. Jim Stark seeks not victory over an enemy, but acceptance into the pack. His coolness in this scene is pure survival instinct. He's defending himself because the world has gone mad, and the adults didn't step in. Scene 2. You're tearing me apart! This is the film's most powerful psychological moment, flipping everything upside down. The scene unfolds at home, on the stairs. Jim Stark finds his father, played by Jim Backus, in a ridiculous apron over his suit, having just dropped a tray of food trying to please a domineering mother. The father crawls on the floor, picking up the pieces, humiliated and pathetic. And then Dean erupts. He grabs his father by the lapels, shakes him, and shouts his immortal line, "You're tearing me apart!" Listen to Dean's tone. It's not the cry of a revolutionary toppling a dictator. Revolutionaries don't weep when they overthrow tyrants. It's the cry of a child begging his father, "Dad, please get off your knees. Be a man. Be strong. Stop me, punish me, hit me, but give me something solid. I don't want to be in charge. I want to be a son." James Dean portrayed the tragedy of fatherlessness with a living father. His character rebels not against order. He rebels against chaos. He's searching for boundaries, wanting to hit a solid wall of parental authority, but instead, he falls into the mush of parental indifference and weakness. It's this total, ringing helplessness, masked as teenage defiance, that made the film a legend. We loved it not because it was strong. We loved it because for the first time in cinema history, it honestly voiced our shared, shameful fear that adults are not in control. The world remembered the red jacket as a banner of freedom, but it was really a distress signal from a sinking ship. Act 8. The failed attempt at growing up. By the time James Dean started filming his third and final movie, the epic saga Giant, he had already become a living deity. Everything was forgiven. His tardiness, rudeness, bizarre antics. Fans and critics were ready to carry him on their shoulders. But Giant became the litmus test that revealed the harsh, nearly fatal limits of his talent, and more importantly, his character. In this film, the 24-year-old actor faced an ambitious task that proved impossible: to portray a man's life in development. He needed to show the transformation of his character, oil tycoon Jet Rink, from a young, impoverished laborer to a gray-haired, life-weary old man. And here, the magic broke. Giant is not the triumph of James Dean, as often believed. It's a documentary of his psychological dead end. He physically couldn't play an adult man because in his 20s, he remained mentally trapped at 12. He didn't know how adults behaved because he refused to grow up. It all started with the choice of director. George Stevens was the complete opposite of Dean's previous cinema fathers, Elia Kazan and Nicholas Ray. Stevens wasn't a therapist. He was a general of cinema. Tough, meticulous, authoritarian, a professional who made grand films and demanded military discipline. Stevens made it clear. He wasn't going to coddle a temperamental star. He wasn't interested in Dean's childhood traumas or late-night soul-searching chats. He looked at Dean coldly, like a hired worker who needed to know his lines and stand in the right place. For Dean, this was catastrophic. He was used to directors loving him, admiring his pain, forgiving his tantrums. But Stevens stripped Dean of his main fuel, emotional support from a father figure. In response, Dean acted not like a professional facing challenges, but like a deeply hurt teenager forbidden from going out. He declared guerrilla warfare on the director, deliberately showing up late, staying holed up in his trailer for days, sleeping on set during lighting setups, and mumbling his lines so quietly that sound engineers went mad. Let's take a close look at the film's final third, where James Dean plays a 50-year-old millionaire. If you strip away the reverence for the legend and look at the screen soberly, it's almost cartoonish. The makeup team did a tremendous job. They shaved Dean's hairline to create a balding effect, dyed his hair gray, painted wrinkles. But beneath that layer of makeup, we don't see an elderly man burdened by years, compromises, and sins. We see a child dressed in grandpa's suit for a school play. His movements remain the same, jerky, youthful. His emotional palette still only contained the bright, explosive, hormonal colors of youth. Sharp resentment, bursts of anger, self-pity. He completely lacked the nuances of maturity. Weariness, cynical calm, heavy authority. Dean tried to play old age through external attributes, but his eyes betrayed a frightened boy. The pinnacle of this failure was the famous banquet scene, Jet Rink's Last Supper. In the plot, the old and drunk tycoon is supposed to give a speech before a room full of guests and then fall face first into his plate. During filming, Dean decided to use his beloved method and got genuinely drunk. He was plastered. As a result, when the cameras rolled, he started mumbling something utterly incoherent. It wasn't a brilliant portrayal of a drunk, it was drunken rambling. George Stevens was furious, but there was no time for a reshoot. Dean died a few days after principal photography wrapped. And here's a chilling fact often hidden. In the final version of the film we watch today, in this key scene, it's not James Dean's voice we hear. His speech was so unintelligible that it had to be completely dubbed by another actor, Nick Adams. Think about that. The greatest scene of the greatest actor isn't voiced by him. His voice, the voice of the eternal boy, was unfit for the body of a grown man. Giant proved something terrifying. If James Dean hadn't died on the highway, his career might have collapsed on its own in a couple of years. He was a genius of youthful pain, but he organically couldn't grow. Death saved him from creative stagnation, from the necessity of growing up, which he feared more than anything. It froze him in the one state where he was perfect, the state of an eternal, wounded teenager who never became a man. Act 9. Speed as sublimation. Most biographers and journalists paint James Dean's love for racing as a typical, cliched hobby of a rich Hollywood kid. A young millionaire buying expensive toys to get his adrenaline fix. It's a shallow, pedestrian view that misses the core of his mental turmoil. For James Dean, speed wasn't a sport, a pastime, or a way to show off for girls. It was the only effective therapy he had. In the world of people, on set, in producer offices, in the beds of lovers and mentors, he always felt vulnerable, dependent, lost. Human relationships brimmed with lies, double meanings, hypocrisy, and the risk of sudden rejection. But inside the tight cockpit of a race car, everything changed. Social games vanished, replaced by the honest, unyielding laws of physics. His famous car, the silver Porsche Spyder he chillingly dubbed Little Bastard, was more than just a vehicle. It was his exoskeleton, his mechanical armor. Outside the car, Dean was a small, nearsighted, hunched guy with a heap of insecurities, mumbling incoherent phrases. But once he got behind the wheel, buckled up, and put on his gloves, he transformed. He became a superhuman. The car gave him what he desperately lacked in life with his father and directors: absolute, crystal-clear cause and effect. Here, it was simple. Respect the machine and do everything right. You live and win. Make a mistake or disrespect the tech. You die. No intrigue, no, I'll call you later. No, you're not good enough. just pure truth of the moment. The internal combustion engine became the only father who never lied to him. To grasp the depth of this dependency, remember the filming of Giant. Warner Brothers, aware of the risks, strictly forbade Dean from racing until the movie wrapped, under threat of massive financial penalties and contract termination. For Dean, these were the most torturous months of his life. It was a true addict's withdrawal, forcibly deprived of his dose. Stripped of his only antidepressant, speed, he became unbearable. He prowled the set like a caged tiger, snapping at makeup artists, provoking conflicts. He experienced what psychologists call phantom pain. He physically missed the steering wheel's vibration. As soon as director George Stevens yelled "cut" on the last day, Dean didn't head to Hawaii for a vacation or throw a party. He immediately swapped his old Porsche Speedster for a more powerful and dangerous 550 Spider and signed up for a race in the city of Salinas. Let's describe this car so you can feel the reality. The Porsche 550 wasn't a comfortable ride for leisurely drives. It was essentially a thin sheet of aluminum wrapped around a powerful racing engine. No roof, no side windows, no soundproofing. When you drove it, you sat just inches from the asphalt. You felt every pebble, every gust of wind, every explosion of fuel in the cylinders. It wasn't comfort. It was pure, distilled presence. Dean told his friends strange, unsettling things. "When I race, I feel whole." This is a key phrase to understanding his personality. On land, in the ordinary world, he was torn to pieces, as his character Jim Stark screamed, ripped apart by contradictions and fears. But on the track, when the speedometer needle pushed past 100 miles an hour, his personality miraculously came together. The noise in his head, the critics' voices, his father's voice, his own insecurity, was drowned out by the engine's roar. He wasn't seeking death, as cheap sensational articles loved to claim. He wasn't suicidal. On the contrary, he was running from life's dullness. Racing was his way to feel alive, brushing as close to oblivion as possible. It was Russian roulette he played every weekend, but he wasn't playing to catch a bullet. He played for the sweet click of the hammer, announcing he was still here, still breathing, still in control of his fate. Speed was his only prayer, and the highway was his temple. Act 10. The fateful day. We've arrived at the most mythologized date in Hollywood's history. September 30th, 1955. Books and documentaries paint this day in dark, gothic hues. They tell us James Dean was cursed, that he sensed his end, that he acted recklessly, courting disaster. They sketch a portrait of a man racing to hell with eyes wide open. Reality, as usual, is far more terrifying and mundane than these romantic tales. That day, James Dean wasn't a grim harbinger of the apocalypse. For perhaps the first time in years, he was genuinely happy, calm, and full of hope. And it's this fact that makes his death unbearably tragic. The blow struck not as he fell into the abyss, but at the peak of his ascent, when he felt life was finally bending to his will. It all began on a sunny Friday morning. Dean went to the shop to pick up his new silver Porsche. With him was his mechanic, Rolf Wütherich, a calm, meticulous professional. They had a safe and logical plan. Load the race car onto a trailer, hitch it to a big, reliable Ford station wagon, and drive comfortably to the city of Salinas, where the weekend races were set to take place. But at the last moment, driven by a sudden impulse, Dean changed his mind. No, take it off the trailer. I'll drive it myself. I need to break in the engine before the race. Feel the car, he said. This split-second decision cost him his life. But that morning, it seemed like the start of a fun adventure. Dean got behind the wheel of the little bastard. Rolf sat beside him. They hit the road. Imagine the sensation. This car had practically no windshield, just a small visor. The wind whipped his face, the sun blinded his eyes, the engine roared right behind him. Dean felt absolute freedom. Filming of Giant was over. Studio bosses could no longer dictate his actions or wardrobe. Ahead lay a weekend of speed and camaraderie. The key moment that shatters the suicidal mood theory happened around 3:30 in the afternoon. Near Bakersfield, a police patrol spotted a silver dot speeding down the highway. Officer Odie Hunter flipped on the siren and pulled over the Porsche. Dean was doing 65 miles per hour in a 55 zone. Usually, a speeding ticket is just a dull piece of paper, but in this case, it's a crucial psychological document of the era. How did the ultimate rebel behave? He didn't mouth off to the cop. He didn't shout, "Do you know who I am?" He didn't try to flee. James Dean acted like a schoolboy caught by the principal. He made excuses, explained the car was new, that it didn't run well in low gears. He meekly signed the ticket, promised to drive slower, and politely said goodbye. This ticket is the cruelest irony of fate. If Officer Hunter had detained him 10 minutes longer to check his papers, if he'd written the ticket more slowly, if he'd arrested him, Dean would still be alive. But the psychological effect ran deeper. Dean felt relieved. In his childlike worldview, it worked like this. I broke a rule, the system, the cop, caught me. I got punished, the ticket, and now I'm clean. I've paid my dues, so everything will be fine. He got his slap on the wrist, and it gave him a false sense of security. They continued on. Dean and Rolf stopped at Blackwell's roadside cafe, sipped colas, ate an apple. Witnesses said Dean was in high spirits, laughing and joking. Then they got back in the car. The sun began to set, casting that eerie, blinding twilight glow over the road. The silver, low-slung car, like a drop of mercury, nearly vanished against the gray asphalt of Highway 46. Dean put on his driving glasses and gloves. He was relaxed. He trusted the road, trusted his mechanic, and trusted his little bastard. He believed the rules of the game were clear. He saw others, others saw him. Less than 30 minutes remained to the fatal intersection. He wasn't seeking death that day. He was heading toward a life that, he naively thought, had finally embraced him. Act 11, The Cult of Youth. This is the most cynical, uncomfortable, and even brutal part of our psychological analysis. But without it, the whole picture remains incomplete. We must muster the courage to ask ourselves an honest, provocative question. Would James Dean have become the greatest legend of the 20th century if he had survived that crash? If doctors had saved him, pieced him back together, and he had continued living? The answer, most likely, won't sit well with you. The answer is no. Death became his most brilliant PR agent. It was the tragedy on the highway that froze him in a moment of absolute, unreachable perfection. We love him not so much for who he was in reality, but for who he might have become. He is an eternal promise, one that will never be broken, because the one who made it left before he could disappoint us. In the entertainment industry, especially in Hollywood, a cruel, inevitable rule of entropy reigns. Heroes age, grow fat, go bald, make mistakes, and sell out. Time mercilessly dismantles any mystery. Look at James Dean's own idol, Marlon Brando. In the early 50s, Brando was a god, a living Greek statue, the embodiment of raw magnetism. But time marched on. By the 70s and 90s, Brando had turned into a bloated, capricious, eccentric man who despised his profession, took on dubious projects for paychecks, and wore robes to hide his weight. Reality shattered the myth of Brando. We watched his decline. James Dean dodged this grim fate. He pulled off a tactical maneuver unavailable to the living. He remained forever 24. His hair never thinned. He never got a beer belly or a double chin. He never divorced with scandals splashed across the tabloids. He never acted in embarrassing mayonnaise or coffee commercials for cash when his career waned. And he never played secondary roles as a grumpy old man. He stayed in humanity's collective memory as the perfect, crystal-clear image of a guy in a red jacket, full of pain, beauty, and hope. He became not a man, but a symbol, an icon untarnished by mundane life. Let's conduct a thought experiment and imagine an alternate history where Dean survives. Try to visualize it. Picture James Dean in 65. He's 34. The era of rebels in leather jackets has passed, ushering in the age of hippies and rock and roll. Dean, always old-fashioned in his musical tastes, feels out of place. His acting style, the raw emotion and tears, starts to seem outdated and overdone to the public. Imagine him in 80. He's pushing 50. He's balding, wearing thick glasses not for style, but out of necessity. He's playing the father of the main character in some forgettable TV series. He gives interviews on morning talk shows, complaining about modern youth and reminiscing about how it used to be. Sounds awful, right? It breaks the magic. But that's the standard, inevitable path of any Hollywood star who has the misfortune to live long. Death spared Dean from the banality of life. It turned his body into marble. We project our own fantasies onto him. For each generation, he is their own because he remains silent. For the teens of the 50s, he was a rebel. For the revolutionaries of the 60s, he became a victim of the system. For the 2000s generation, he turned into a style icon and hipster #1. He became an empty, perfect vessel that we fill with our meanings, fears, and desires. We print his face on T-shirts next to Che Guevara and Marilyn Monroe, not because he changed the world politically or socially, but because he remained a possibility that will never become a dull reality. His early death is a tragedy for the man, but it's the only foundation on which his immortal myth stands. Act 12. The verdict. We've reached the final point of our investigation. The moment we embarked on this long, painful journey through the alleys of James Dean's soul. Throughout this text, I've been proving one idea step by step. Dean wasn't an aggressive rebel tearing down societal norms. He was a naive, frightened child, desperately seeking protection from fatherly figures and truly believing in the justice of rules. The moment of truth didn't come on the red carpet, but at a dusty crossroads in the California desert. The last words James Dean spoke in his life are absolute, undeniable proof of my theory. They shatter the myth of the reckless daredevil and leave us alone with the bitter truth. It was 15 minutes to 6. The sun was setting, casting blinding, slanted rays across the valley. James Dean sped down Highway 46 in his silver Porsche. He felt confident. Coming towards him on Highway 41 was a heavy, unwieldy black and white Ford Tudor. Behind the wheel sat 23-year-old Polytechnic student Donald Turnipseed. Just an ordinary guy heading home to his parents. At the intersection, locals called fatal, even before this crash, Turnipseed began making a left turn. He crossed into Dean's lane. Due to the twilight and the car's color, he physically couldn't see the low, gray sports car blending with the gray asphalt and long shadows. At that moment, Dean's mechanic, Rolf Vutherick, sitting in the passenger seat, realized the inevitable. He saw the Ford blocking their path. Rolf screamed in horror, "Slow down! Damn it, he doesn't see us!" And there it was, the moment of truth. How does the rebel react? Dean doesn't slam on the brakes, trying to save himself at any cost. He doesn't swerve off the road. He doesn't shout curses. He calmly turns his head to Rolf and utters a phrase that echoes into eternity. "That guy's got to stop. He'll see us." Think about every word of that phrase. These aren't the words of a kamikaze challenging death. They're the words of a child who believes adults follow the rules of the game. He's got to stop. It's an appeal to law, order, the norm. Dean was sure. Since I'm on the main road, they'll let me pass. He believed in the system. He'll see us. It's the manifestation of his main narcissistic fear and hope. He believed that he, James Dean, was so important, so huge and significant, that he simply couldn't be overlooked. He believed the world revolved around him. James Dean didn't die because of his daring or speeding. He died because of his childish, tragic naivety. He believed the other driver, the figure of the other, the figure of the adult, would take care of him and give way. He entrusted his life to a stranger in a Ford, just as he entrusted his soul to directors and mentors. But this time, it didn't help. Reality, 2 tons of Ford steel, crashed into expectations, the fragile aluminum of the Porsche. The impact was monstrous. The Porsche was thrown aside, turning into a heap of twisted metal. James Dean broke his neck and suffered multiple internal injuries. He died almost instantly on the way to the hospital. His myth was born the moment his heart stopped. The newspapers the next morning carried headlines about the death of the speed demon. The world remembered him as the guy who lived fast and died young. But in truth, at that crossroads, a frightened boy died, who just wanted to be noticed, and who believed until the last fraction of a second that the world would be kind to him. Now, next time you see that famous black and white photo, the handsome guy in a coat with the collar up, cigarette in his teeth, rain on Times Square, you'll know the truth. You won't see the rebel without a cause. You won't see a sex symbol or a style icon. You'll see Jimmy, the boy who never got off that train in Indiana, taking him away from his mother's grave. The boy who wore a mask of coolness to hide the trembling in his knees. An actor who wasn't playing roles but was screaming for help in every take, hoping Dad would finally hear. The reality is, his rebellion wasn't against society, but against total soul-eating loneliness. And maybe that's why we love him even more 70 years later than his contemporaries did. Not for his strength, but for his unbearable human fragility, which he so desperately tried to hide, and which ultimately became his only true legacy. But James Dean wasn't the first victim of this ruthless machine. 30 years before him, Hollywood destroyed the man who created the very concept of superstar, Rudolph Valentino. The official story goes that the great lover died from a random illness, peritonitis. It's a convenient lie for medical reports. The reality is far scarier. Valentino was the first in history to fall victim to what we now call toxic masculinity. He wasn't killed by an infection. He was killed by the collective, primal hatred of American men who couldn't forgive him for the fact that their women desired him more than them. This isn't a story of illness. It's a chronicle of the public execution of a man for being too beautiful. He wasn't a predator, but a hostage, whose psyche was systematically broken by newspaper headlines until his body simply refused to live. Want to know how society can kill an idol without a single shot? I'll tell you the true story of the first idol who died of shame. See you there.